If you want your paintings to look realistic and not cartoony, there's several important ways we need to shift how we think and even how we see. The truth is, the biggest challenge for beginners is to overcome the lies that our brain tells us, specifically when it comes to trying to paint anything detailed and complex. Between my in-person workshops and online mentorships, I've helped hundreds of people become better painters, and today I'm going to go over the most common mistakes I see and tell you how to avoid them. The first thing that we need to do when we're drawing is to separate this idea that we are drawing a building or drawing a tree or drawing even a face. We need to understand that whatever it is that we're drawing, it's just a series of flat shapes or points on a two-dimensional surface. Once we start to abstract what we see, it's much easier to copy and translate that two-dimensional vision that we are seeing in real life onto our canvas. One of the ways that we're doing when we're starting a new painting is to use something called a plumb line. Now, a plumb line is a vertical line dropped down somewhere within your drawing that helps you relate points vertically. So I used the plumb line from the top of the dome all the way down to some of the jambs that were aligned vertically underneath it, and that helped remind me that whatever it is that I think I'm painting, it's just a series of shapes. And more importantly, it helped me remind myself of the relationship between these shapes. Because whenever we're drawing, it's the relationship of certain points that we need to translate onto our flat surface to paint realistically. Now, the second thing that beginners often get wrong is thinking that they need to draw everything at the beginning of the painting. But that's not the case. We only need to draw what's visually important. You can see here on this painting that I actually didn't spend a whole lot of time drawing every single arch and architectural element before starting to put down some color. When painting from observation, we are reacting to what we see. There is a hierarchy of information that matters, and the most important thing is to separate out your most important masses. Here, I made sure to separate out the contour of the basilica against the sky and the ground plane and some of the central features. There are hundreds of small features I ignored at this stage. Our brain is naturally wired to look for details, but if we dive into those details too soon, it's really easy to mess up the drawing, the values. Speaking of, that brings us to the third thing people often get wrong: mixing realistic color and understanding local versus global color. At this point in the process, I'm starting to make decisions about the value and color that I see. This is what people mean when they say keying a painting. I'm setting up either a low or high value key to the painting and deciding how to translate the relationships of color that I see, and that starts with a decision. If you're looking at this painting and then back at the building in the background, maybe you see some discrepancies. Maybe the painting looks a little bit too blue right now and you can't really believe if that's even possible or realistic. And maybe you think I might be messing things up a little bit. But give me a second and I'll show you what I'm seeing. And what was that local and global color thing I mentioned a second ago? The local color of an object is the redness of an apple or the blueness of a sky. It's the inherent color that that object has. But the global color is whatever that object looks like from a point in space with the full effects of distance and atmosphere and bounce light and anything else. When we're painting, and especially when we're painting outside, it's the global color that we need to aim for. Our mind can look at an object pretty easily and identify its color, the off-white marble, but we need to remember that this is the crack of dawn and that basilica is in shadow. Global color is what we need to mix and match with our paint, not local color. Painting local color is the #1 reason why our colors can look childish when we're just beginners. A few practical ways to observe global color instead of getting confused for local color is by using a color picker with one of those gray viewfinders, comparing it to something really black like making a dark hole with our hand, or something really white like shining our flashlight on our phone. Anything that helps us forget what we think we are seeing and makes us focus on what we are actually seeing. This is the key to painting realistically. The reason so many people struggle with painting realistically is because our brain is wired to think of objects and their characteristics and to see details and colors that sometimes aren't actually visible. When it comes to painting, our brains are liars. By this point in the painting, things are starting to get going, so let's recap the hurdles we already encountered. We needed to ignore what our brain was telling us about this building, and by flattening what we see into a bunch of points in a two-dimensional space that is our field of vision, we can accurately compare proportions and alignments and translate what we're seeing onto our flat canvas. We needed to ignore all the tiny details and tiny elements that our brain can identify if we're looking in closely at that building and focus in on the largest masses to avoid a piecemeal look when blocking in. Finally, we needed to ignore the color that our brain was telling us that the building is and actually pay attention to the color of the facade of the building in shadow during the early morning from 100 feet away. In other words, we're constantly focusing on the big picture. As humans, we're not made to study what we're seeing in front of us. It's not something we're used to. We go through life using our vision to tell us things about the world that we see around us, and then we organize those and file them away in our brain. When we start drawing and painting for the first time, we're often overwhelmed by our inclination to continue thinking about the world in terms of symbols and characteristics, and we see it this way. Therefore, the solution to paint anything realistically is to actually look to paint it abstractly and to disassociate what it is that we're looking at. The more we're able to break things down in terms of points and shapes of color, the better off we're going to be. This isn't the only thing that's important, but it is the foundation to painting, and it's my fundamental approach to painting visually. Painting visually is sometimes presented as being in opposition to painting conceptually or using construction, but that's not quite the way I look at it. Eventually, I incorporate certain concepts into my own work, but for me, this visual approach is always fundamental, and any concepts should only help me see more and not convince myself that there are things there I cannot see. I'm wary of anyone teaching a conceptual or constructive approach first because I find these approaches are often limiting. They only teach you how to paint or draw one subject, and they can often result in paintings or drawing that can look cartoonish. Personally, my goal is to one day paint half as good as Velasquez or Sargent or Repin, and not Andrew Loomis. But if you guys are animators or illustrators, that's totally cool too. It's a big art world out there. This is just what I'm interested in, and this is the way I think you have to go for it. If this approach resonates with you, I should also mention I'm teaching a plein workshop back in Venice later this year in May, as well as some other locations, but I'll tell more about that later. If you're not quite convinced, let's talk about perspective. Now, perspective is a prime example of the visual versus conceptual or constructive debate. Something I see all the time is people might have a basic knowledge of perspective, and when they go to draw a building, they try to reconstruct it. It has the same amount of floors and maybe the same amount of windows, but what happens is the proportions are totally off, and sometimes the actual perspective, the angle of which they're viewing the building, is also completely off. It's a little bit like they were trying to draw a cube and they end up making it a rectangular prism from a different angle. For me, it's far more important to be able to break down what I'm seeing into shapes and points and alignments rather than to reconstruct the building in perspective. Eventually, we can use our knowledge of perspective, the way orthogonals should recede and how ellipses work, to strengthen our visual impression, but we shouldn't let it precede it. The way I approached this painting was by finding my plumb line, the angle of the base, and then going right into the shapes. You don't really need to know a whole lot of perspective when you're painting building, and you also don't need to know a whole lot of anatomy when you're painting a figure or a whole lot of botany when you're painting a tree. The most important thing when painting any of these subjects is to work visually and to break down what it is that you're actually seeing. If we take a visual first approach, we're going to paint it much more realistically. This is the exact principle that allows us to tackle any complex and detailed subject and to simplify it down into painting. So we need to paint what we see, but oftentimes our brain is lying to us. So what do? There are two ways to change the way that we actually see the world from an hyperactive monkey brain to an honest, natural vision. The first option is to change the way that we think. The way that we think is upstream from the way that we see. If we can incorporate this mental model of trying to find flat points and shapes for a drawing and understanding the basics of color, that brings us really, really far. And there are other useful mental models to explore further down the road. But there are also a lot of practical things you can try to do to abstract your actual vision. One of these things is by using a mirror, or for everyday use, our glass smartphone when the screen is dark. We can look at it not only upside down, but even sideways, and if we angle it at a 45-degree angle. This really helps us abstract any drawing information by making our eyes forget what it is that we're actually looking at. Something that really helps us abstract value or color information is playing around with our eyes, and there are a few ways that we can do that. If we wear glasses because we're nearsighted, we can just take those glasses off and observe our blurry vision, abstracting the color information for what it is. There's also a way that you can control your vision to blur your sight on command if you don't have glasses or you don't want to take them off. For some people, that's kind of like wiggling their ears. Some people have an easy way to do it, and others have no idea what I'm talking about, but just try it and maybe it'll work for you. Squinting is really good for simplifying detail and paying attention to big value relationships. The last thing is something that you might call reverse blinking. So picture this, you're facing your subject with your eyes closed and open them for the length of time that you might blink. It's just a split second. What happens is you'll see the most important information as an after image, and you'll try to remember that. It'll compress all the detail, the values, and you'll simply focus on the big picture. All of this helps us keep the big picture in mind, but what do we do when we're finally approaching the end of our painting and we're ready to add in some detail? Well, the key for capturing the big picture is to be able to capture those abstract relationships of the largest masses and shapes. If we're staying within a visual mindset, getting into the details is the exact same process. Just like the largest shapes have relationships to each other within our picture frame, we can further model these largest shapes into medium shapes and the medium shapes into small shapes. The thing you need to avoid is switching back accidentally into a symbol mode of thinking about what it is that you're painting. So even if I'm getting into painting a fresco or a door, I try to avoid thinking about a fresco or a door and always try to think in terms of a shape of color that I'm putting down and trying to find its right spot. It's a little bit like a puzzle, and you need to figure out how these shapes fit next to each other, but you also need to figure out what the shapes actually are and where do they go. It's your choice of how resolved you want your painting to be. By going for the biggest visual relationships first, this sets your painting up to look a whole lot like the subject very early on. From this point, you decide on which areas of your painting have the highest level of detail and where you might want to include areas of rest or leave more suggestive and painterly and loose. Everything that we've talked about in this video so far is what I call an analytical approach to painting. When we're just starting out, our paintings fail to look realistic because we're stuck in a naive approach. We don't yet know how to paint what we're actually seeing, and instead we tend to paint symbols or ideas of what we think we're looking at. Part of the reason I chose this painting to talk about this topic is there's actually a small story to it. While I was painting this, it was out early in the morning and I was painting alongside two friends. By the end of the session, one of my friends, Tara, who was painting maybe 15 feet away, she came up and said, "Whoa, there's nothing there." And what she meant by that was that the painting was reading really well from afar, but when she was looking up close, it was surprising how loosely it was actually painted, and yet it still read. It was pretty funny in the moment, and I thought it really encapsulates this idea of how I'm painting realistically. To paint realistically, we don't need to be scientists to know everything. The real challenge is to faithfully observe our own sense of vision and to not fall prey to the misguiding of our own mind. It's kind of a visual approach, and it has some of its roots back in the 19th century philosophy from the atelier of Carolus Duran and the admiration of Velázquez as the first impressionist. It's not the only method out there, it's just mine. And if you want to find more information on that plein air workshop in Venice, it's going to be 4 full days of painting in plein air around the city, where we're going to be diving into all these topics and more to make you a better painter. So the link for that is in the description and also here in the corner, along with other in-person or even online courses. Hope you might have found some of this useful, and catch you in the next one.